Hit the subscribe button before you saddle up on a $10 Mustang and head 'em off at the pass with a brand new audiobook every week. Chapter 1. When Rip Campbell awoke, he was lying face down on the rocky earth, his head throbbing as if his skull had been caved in. The earth seemed to rock crazily beneath him, and for several minutes he was too sick to think of anything else. But the nausea passed finally, and Rip twisted his lithe body sidewise in a slow roll. His tawny eyes stared glassily up into pale light, and there was a sick pallor beneath the healthy tan of his lean, youthful face. His mind reeled uncertainly. Yet certain thoughts were beginning to hammer at his throbbing brain. He remembered coming into this little lava-ringed sink before sundown and preparing to camp for the night. He remembered bathing his face and hands in the tepid water that was held in a basin beneath the lava bluff that now looked strangely dim. Rip kept blinking his eyes, trying to bring the world around him into better focus. "Wonder what happened," he croaked, and was shocked at the thick, raspy sound of his own voice. But consciousness was returning swiftly now, and his mind worked a bit more clearly. He remembered squatting beside the water hole, after washing the film of Arizona alkali from his face. He remembered distinctly that he had taken the precious money belt from beneath his shirt to sit counting the $4,000 hard cash the heavy belt held. He had just sold his spread over in New Mexico and was heading for Bannocktown, up on Salt River, in search of a new location. He had been counting the money with which he had meant to buy up some good little spread further north. His thoughts jarred to a halt, and he sat up with a muffled cry of alarm. His lean hands had gone instinctively to his waist, feeling for the comfortable bulge of the money belt. But the belt was gone. And now he got another shock, for he saw that the pale light into which he stared was the cool white light of a huge moon that rode high in the sky. "Hell," the man gasped. "I've been asleep for 4 or 5 hours. It wasn't sundown when I set counting that money. What in blazes?" Rip was thoroughly awake now, and staring in dumbfounded amazement at the lean fingers of his right hand. He had lifted that hand to his throbbing head, and now he was staring at his fingers, which were sticky with crimson. The truth dawned upon him then, and he groaned as his fingers went back to his scalp, probing through matted wads of yellow hair that were stiff with dried crimson. His fingers found the raw edges of a deep gash that slanted along his skull above the right ear. "Bullet done that," he gasped. "I've been shot and robbed." The discovery was like a plunge into icy water. It left Rip Campbell numb and shaken for a moment, while he stared unseeingly into the moonlight about him. Then he was on his feet, snarling in rage as he reeled toward the water hole. He ducked his throbbing head several times, then made a crude bandage of strips torn from his undershirt. That done, he found his hat, stared briefly at the 2 bullet holes in it, and wedged it on over the clumsy bandage. "Robbed," he kept choking. "Some skunk seen me counting that money and bowled me over from ambush." Rip's rage died to a smoldering anger, and his brain began working smoothly once more. He had heard no gun roar, yet a bullet had grazed his head, knocked him cold. Which meant, he knew, that the shot had come from a long distance and had been fired from a rifle. The slug had hit him, knocking him cold, before the sound of the gun sifted down into the sink. "I'll bet a $10 Mustang some snake was watching me through powerful glasses and seen me take that money out to look at it," the youth rasped. "But the skunk can't be far. I'll find." Rip had turned as he spoke, knowing exactly where he had left his saddle. But he did not finish speaking. He stood now with jaw lax, new terror gripping him. His saddle was gone, and he knew without further investigation that his big roan would not be in the sink. But he started out instantly, whistling to the horse, stopping now and then to listen. After half an hour, he was back at the water hole, trembling with such a rage as he had never before known. Afoot, and no telling how many miles from the Salt and Bannocktown. He growled, And while I sit here, maybe for days, waiting until some wandering cowpoke or prospector rides past, that bushwhacking snake will blow the money I aim to buy a spread with." The thought prodded Rip, caused him to whirl to the spot where he had left his saddle. He had seen the canteen come unhooked from the saddle horn as he laid the gear aside, and almost ran now to the spot. But whoever had gathered up the saddle had also taken the canteen. He realized then and there that his plight was next to hopeless. He was stranded, no telling how far from a ranch or mine, afoot, and without means of carrying water. Not even the hardiest desert rat would have tackled that searing, waterless land without at least one canteen. But Rip Campbell was entirely too mad to consider the consequences. He went to the water hole, drank all he could, then marched straight up out of the sink, tawny eyes glinted and hot, hands hovering suggestively above the butts of his guns. When he finally cooled down enough to realize just what he had done, it was much too late to turn back. The rage within him ebbed somewhat, yet his tawny eyes remained squinted, and there was a hard twist to his lips. His feet became blistered, for high-heeled cow boots are poor footgear for hiking across the desert. But Rip set his teeth against the pain of blistered heels and scalded toes. He tramped on and on, trying to tell himself that Salt River could not be far away, and that he could reach it easily by noon. Yet in the back of his brain, the lanky puncher knew that he could never reach the river and its life-giving water by noon. He knew, too, that he had done a foolish thing in leaving the little sink where the water hole was. But when he thought of the water hole and what had happened there, his anger flared, driving him on. The moon grew pale, and through weary eyes Rip saw that daylight was breaking. "Have to hole up during the day," he rasped grimly. No man could stand to walk through the heat without water. But when night comes again. He left the sentence unfinished to plod on and on. It would not be hot for a few hours yet, and he was heading toward some tall hills that loomed starkly through the coming light. There was the 1,000-to-1 shot that he could stumble onto a water hole in hills of that size. He realized that he was already thirsty, and tried not to think what that thirst would be by night. He plodded to the top of a ridge, crossed through brush and jumbled rock, and started down the far slope. From below came a shrill whinny, and Rip Campbell stopped short, head jerking up, swinging to the left. Below him, he saw a small house of some sort, with a barn and corral out back. With a glad cry on his lips, he started down the slope, realizing that a horse had whinnied somewhere about the place. He saw smoke curling from the chimney of the little house, and realized that he had by sheer accident come upon some isolated ranch. But as he neared the place, he felt his enthusiasm suddenly wane, and realized that there was a tingling something playing along his nerves. Rip slowed to a walk, frowning, trying to understand that danger signal that went playing through him. Then he heard the horse whinny again, and glanced toward the corral. He stopped dead in his tracks, eyes fairly popping out. There was his own big roan, breasting the pole fence, whinnying a greeting to him. Chapter 2. Rip's first impulse was to call out to the horse. But he darted into a stand of mesquite, hands slapping the butts of his guns. From somewhere in the house had come a loud voice, and Rip realized that someone besides himself had been attracted by the roan's whinnies. Rip burrowed back into the thorny brush a few feet, fighting the desire to charge madly down upon the house and settle this thing once and for all. It stood to reason that the man or men who had robbed him were down there. But that, he knew, would be the action of a fool. The thing to do was wait his chance, then sneak up to the house and see just how many men he had to deal with. No ordinary rancher or cowboy would shoot a man from ambush, then rob him, Rip growled. I've likely blundered onto a regular bandit hangout. In which case, I'll have to walk careful if I get my money and my horse back. He heard a door slam, and a moment later a short, bow-legged man came snooping around a corner of the house, a cocked 6-gun gripped in each hand. Rip watched the sunlight play over twisted, evil features, and knew that the short Jasper was plenty salty. The man prowled about the place only a minute or two, however, then disappeared around the corner again. Rip waited until he heard a door slam, then went streaking toward the back wall of the house, guns out and ready for action. The roan in the corral spotted him and began whinnying, yet Rip kept on, never once glancing back. He reached the wall of the house, breathing hard as he flattened against it. From within came the shuffling of feet and the coarse laughter of men. Rip saw a window and began working toward it carefully, making sure that his clothing did not rub the wall or that his boots did not slap the hard ground too loudly. "Better hurry it up, old woman." Rip heard the voice so plainly that it stopped him. "Wally and me ain't got all day to set around waiting for our grub." "Yes, sir," came a meek, tired voice. "I hurry with your breakfast." Rip was at the window now, raking the bullet-punctured Stetson from his bandaged head. He peered in cautiously, eyes squinting to pierce the gloom of the room. He saw two men seated at a table, and recognized one of them instantly as the short Jasper who had been outside prowling around. The other man was lean, with an evil beak of a nose that hung above a gash of a mouth that seemed cast in a permanent sneer. That lean-looking Jasper had a pair of pale, unwinking eyes that were boring into an aged Mexican who sat slumped in a chair in the center of the room. "You sure that horse didn't have no cause to be whinnying like it is, Wally?" the cold-eyed man asked, switching his gaze to the evil-looking Jasper who had come out of the house to prowl around not long ago. "I'm plumb certain that it was only that roan's way of asking for his breakfast." The evil-looking Wally shrugged. "Heck, feller, we ain't got nothing to worry about. My bullet sure took care of that." "Shut your mouth, fool," Lou snarled harshly. "Save your gabbing until we see the boss." He gave his head a sharp jerk toward the aged Mexican, who seemed little interested in what went on. The squat Wally laughed broadly, slid a hand down under the table, and brought a huge 6-gun into sight, which he cocked and aimed at the old Mexican. "If you're scared of this old buzzard talking any, Lou, I'll fix him here and now." Wally leered evilly. "Say the word, and I'll blast a hole in his head just like I did the other one." Lou answered, but Rip Campbell was not there to listen. Knowing now that the old Mexican was no friend of those evil-looking hombres who sat at the table, Rip went racing along the wall of the house on tiptoe. He came to a kitchen door, holstered his guns, and pulled the door open. He saw a gray-haired little Mexican woman standing over the stove and lifted his hand quickly to motion for silence. "No word, little mother," Rip said softly in Spanish. "Those two gringos in there are not welcome here, are they?" The woman's hand shook as she placed a coffee pot on the hot stove. Wide-eyed, she stared up into Rip's lean face. "Hey, old woman, how about that grub?" came a snarling voice from the adjoining room. "You get a hustle on, hear me?" "Silence, please," Rip hissed at the Mexican woman and put a finger to the end of his nose. He turned swiftly toward a middle door. He crossed the room on the balls of his feet, hands dangling above the butts of his guns. "It's about time," a voice grated as he stepped through the middle door. "You're lazier than, what the?" "So you two want breakfast?" Rip Campbell's voice was deadly calm as he halted just inside the little dining room. Wally and Lou were staring up at him, mouths open as if they were trying to yell and couldn't. "Your slug didn't do much damage to this hard head of mine last night." Rip grinned, but there was no mirth in the grin. From listening at the window, he had heard enough to know that Wally was the Jasper who had tried to kill him the evening before. But neither Lou nor Wally knew just how Rip had come into possession of such knowledge, and his words drained their faces of color. "It's him," Lou gasped and let one shaky hand slide toward his middle, fingers groping. Rip saw the motion and knew that his own money belt was hidden there beneath the greasy shirt of that pale-eyed rascal. But Rip had no time to see much else about Lou just then. With a scream of fear and rage, the squat Wally heaved himself backward from the table, hands clawing at holstered guns. Those guns came out roaring thunderously, and Rip felt a slug rake skin from his side. But Rip's own hands had licked down, and from the level of his hips came twin streamers of flame and smoke. Wally lurched, dropped his guns, and clamped both grimy hands to his round middle. He screamed an oath, skidded along the floor for a foot or two, then lay gagging and moaning weakly. Rip whirled, and was just in time to see Lou jumping through a side window. Rip's guns rapped out a string of shots, but he felt pretty sure that his slugs all missed. He ran to the window, but hesitated short of peering out, realizing that to do so was to make of himself a perfect target. "The door, son," a shrill voice called. "That Lou Trask hombre will run for his horse at the corral. If you make the haste." Rip spun toward the aged Mexican, who had sat in the chair as if dazed. The old fellow was very much alive now, and had snatched Wally's fallen guns from the floor. Hard on the heels of the old man, Rip raced to a far end of the room, where a door opened out into the yard. They went through the door so swiftly that Rip, unaccustomed to the place, tripped on steep steps and fell sprawling against the old Mexican. He heard bullets slapping the adobe wall above them, and scrambled frantically to his hands and knees. He saw a horseman leave the corral, and lurched to his feet, guns snapping up. The rider was the gangly, pale-eyed Lou, lying flat along the neck of a bareback horse. Rip's gun steadied, then sagged down slowly. That Lou Jasper had his money belt, of that Rip was certain. Yet to get Lou now, he would have to shoot the horse, and Rip Campbell could not bring himself to do that. "But you are the clumsy one." A disgusted voice jerked Rip around, as Lou dipped into heavy brush beyond the corral. The old Mexican stood there, looking up at him out of smoldering eyes. "I'm sorry I ran smack over you, amigo," Rip drawled. "But I kind of tripped on them steps, seems like." The old Mexican shrugged, tossed the two big guns aside, and stood looking Rip up and down out of thoughtful eyes. "You have the hurt head, and you have walked the long distance," he said at last. "For why you fight with those two so evil ones?" "Because the snake-brained pair stole my roan horse yonder, and my money," Rip snarled and told swiftly what had happened the night before. "I don't savvy the play none at all," he finished hotly. "But I aim to have that money back. You know who them two are?" "Lou Trask is the one which got away," the old Mexican said. "The fat-bellied one you shoot is Wally Haskell. They work, those two, for the mighty Cactus Ranch." "Never heard of the spread," Rip growled, swiftly reloading his guns. "But I'll look it up. And that white-eyed Lou Trask will fork over my money, or—" "You never hear of Jethro Lee and the mighty Cactus Ranch, which is his?" the Mexican cut in swiftly. "Never did," Rip gritted. "But I aim to. Come on, senor. We better see about that skunk I had to drill." Wally Haskell was lying flat on his back, sightless eyes open and staring. The round-paunched Jasper had bushwhacked his last man. The old Mexican stood beside Rip Campbell, looking down at the dead man. "It is too bad for you," the old fellow said slowly. "I had to do it," Rip said grimly. "It was me or him, that's all." "I did not mean that," the Mexican answered grimly. "What I mean, my son, that it is too bad that such a boy as you must die." "Die?" Rip echoed, in honest surprise. "See, my son," came the grim answer. "Those who cross the mighty Jethro Lee, they die very quickly. And you have crossed the mighty Lee when you shoot this evil one here. Besides, the one you make run away, Lou Trask, is foreman of the whole Cactus Ranch. It is sad, but you will die." Chapter 3. Rip ate a wholesome breakfast there at the little ranch. The old gray-haired woman was happy to share hot mushy beans and fresh tortillas. There were a couple of eggs from scrawny chickens that scratched and pecked in the yard, but no bacon or sausage. Juan made excuses for the lack of meat, but Rip waved him off. Beans in a pot were a mainstay of cattle prodding, and the eggs were a treat when there was no meat. Anna made a little salsa from peppers and tomatoes in a tiny little garden in the shady side of the house, and heaped a generous portion over his plate. It made a tasty little interlude from the hardtack biscuits he had been nibbling on when he couldn't scare up a rabbit on the trail. He learned that the owners were Juan and Ana Amato, who had once owned a fine big ranch which had been taken from them by Jethro Lee, who owned the big cactus spread. Rip talked little but listened much, and when he rode away from the two aged folks, he knew much of the country's history. He knew, too, the trail to town, and put his big roan to it. His guns were loose in their holsters, and never had those tawny eyes watched brush and boulder patches more sharply as he galloped through the still, cool morning. But nothing happened, and he came into the squalid little town of Bannock shortly before noon. Ponies dozed here and there in the shade of huge cottonwood trees, for the town was built on the very banks of Salt River. Rip's eyes followed the sweep of the fertile valley as he galloped down the last slope, and he felt his pulse race. This was cattle country. A man with a little capital could get a start in this new country, build himself a spread that would be a regular paradise. But Rip's capital had been taken from him, and the thought brought his eyes sweeping back to the one dingy street that was flanked on either side by squat adobe buildings. He could see the long sandbars at the ford below town, where stagecoach and freight wagon crossed Salt River. He was more interested in his immediate surroundings and began glancing at the horses bunched here and there beneath cottonwood trees. He saw the cactus brand on several animals and was shunting his own mount into the shade of a big tree when loud voices caused him to glance across and down the street. A group of men came boiling out of a saloon's doors to bunch and stand, peering back into the room. Rip dismounted, ground-tied his horse, and went across the street. "Better not go in there, hombre," a man called as he approached the doors. "Jethro Lee is drunk and hunting trouble. Him and his foreman. Hey, hold on." Rip had heard enough to make him suddenly interested in what was happening inside. He shoved almost roughly through the crowd, wide shoulders swinging men right and left. He reached the saloon doors, pushed through them, and stepped calmly into a long, cool barroom that smelled of stale tobacco smoke and sour beer. At the long bar stood two men, facing each other over leveled guns. Rip recognized Lou Trask instantly, and let his own hands sink swiftly to the butts of his holstered weapons. The man facing Lou Trask was a big, raw-boned hombre, with bristly black hair that had been cropped close to his flat-skulled head. That head jerked around now, and Rip saw thick lips, a flat, fleshy nose, and evil little black eyes that stared with the fixity of a snake's eyes. Rip grinned thinly, for those two Jaspers were not fooling him in the least with their little horseplay of wanting to drill each other. When he stepped into the room, those two had been talking swiftly, earnestly, despite the fact that they were leveling guns at each other. They wanted the barroom cleared while Lou Trask made his report, Rip thought swiftly, as he paced easily down the floor. Lou Trask's head swung now, and the lanky coyote jumped as if prodded with a hot iron. "Steady," Rip snarled. "Either of you sons make a bad move, and I'll let you have a slug to chew on. Just keep your guns gouging each other if you want to stay healthy." Rip's guns had flicked out, were trained on the pair before the bar. Trask licked at his lips, cursing under his breath. The big Jasper began grunting like an uneasy hog. Rip saw reddish lights flash in those ugly black eyes. "You're Jethro Lee, owner of the cactus outfit." Rip spoke flatly, yet his voice carried outside the doors to where a throng of more than curious men were watching him. "Has Trask told you yet how him and another of your skunk-scented heel dogs tried to kill me last night?" Rip went on grimly. "Well, they did. And from what I hear, that's nothing unusual for cactus men to pull." Rip walked steadily forward as he talked. He stopped within 2 feet of the men, holstered his right-hand gun, and reached out. "If you even flinch, Trask, I'll kill you," he said grimly. "I'm taking that money belt of mine, which is likely still inside your shirt. You both stand hitched if you want to keep on thinking up murderous schemes." "So this is a hold-up," Lee's voice came at last, and it was like the bellow of a gorged bull. "Feller, I don't know who you are. But you're sure a pilgrim in these parts, or you'd know better than to meddle with me. Tough, are you? Rip snarled. Wait until I snake this belt off, huh? Thought so. Rip suddenly jammed his hand inside Trask's greasy shirt front. He brought the hand back out now, and with it came the well-filled money belt. Lou made a whining noise in his long neck, face chalk white and twitching. Jethro wheezed an oath, bunched his muscles slowly. But the look in Rip's tawny eyes warned him to forget whatever resistance he might be thinking of. One of you hombres out there, come on in, Rip called without taking his gaze from the cactus men. Any gent out there got the sand to step in here and do a little chore for me? For a long moment there was utter silence. Rip was beginning to feel that he was to have no help when he heard a stir somewhere beyond the saloon doors, and a calm voice asking for room to walk. Then boots thumped the floor, and a moment later old Juan Amado was beside him, grinning faintly as he looked at the snarling, uneasy pair. But Senor Lee, old Juan called loudly. You and Senor Trask make the mistake. You hold the guns on each other, not this muchacho. A snicker lifted from outside the doors, a snicker that swiftly became a patter of laughter. Smart, are you? Lee choked. Now you listen to me, old man. I've had trouble with you before, and been lenient. If you help this blasted stick-up man any, you'll pay for it. I do not wear the guns, Senor Lee, the old Mexican answered calmly. If you should shoot me, it would be murder. And even the great Jethro Lee might hang for murder. Juan, open this here money belt, Rip called loudly, wanting to make his voice carry to the men outside the door. There ought to be $4,000 even in it. There also ought to be a letter with my name on it. The name is Rip Campbell. The aged Mexican took the money belt, opened it, and began piling currency out onto the bar. See, muchacho, he nodded a few minutes later. There is here the $4,000. And here also is a letter, addressed to Rip Campbell, New Mexico. Jethro Lee and his cactus foreman were trembling now, terror and anger in their eyes. You two will pay for this, Lee snarled. Polecat, you and this old dead man has robbed. There came a commotion at the door. Then an authoritative voice snapped commands as booted feet thudded inside the room. Rip dared not glance around, for he had seen Lee and Trask both tense, waiting for him to give them a chance to use the guns they were still gripping. Ah, Senor Sheriff Brill Cooley, Rip heard old Juan Amado purr. You are just in time, Sheriff. This muchacho. Get the drop on these two snakes, Brill? Jethro Lee's bellowing voice cut in. This here kid got the drop on Lou and me, and made Lou fork over that money belt there. This is a holdup, Sheriff. Rip Campbell stepped swiftly away from the snarling pair of cactus toughs, but kept his guns and his eyes on them. He risked one swift, sidelong glance, however, and saw a lank, grizzled man stalking grimly forward, tugging at a holstered Colt as he advanced. Drop them guns, young feller, the lank old hombre ordered. And if you try anything funny, you'll wish you hadn't. Rip lowered his guns, jammed them quickly into holsters, and backed away a pace, eyes swinging to search the grim face of lanky old Sheriff Brill Cooley. As he turned, Jethro Lee slanted his guns, thumbs hooking at the hammers. He had those guns trained squarely on Campbell's broad back, and the spiked hammers were lifting, ready to slam forward against waiting primers. Chapter 4. It was Lou Trask who saw Lee's play and leaned swiftly forward. Trask snarled an oath from one corner of his gash mouth, and brought his long right arm ripping down. Trask's arm struck Lee's thick wrists, causing his guns to slant toward the floor a split second before they exploded. Rip whirled, his hands streaking for his own weapons. But there was a gun muzzle gouging his back, and he let his weapons rest in their soft holsters. Next man that tries anything gets shot, Sheriff Cooley advised grimly. Lee, was you aiming to drill this kid through the back? Jethro Lee's thick lips were skinned back from a row of gold-crowned teeth in a snarl of insane rage. He lifted a gun as if to strike at his foreman, but seemed to catch himself suddenly, realized just what sort of a mess he had let himself in for. I stumbled over my own big feet and bumped into the boss just as he was letting the hammers down on his cutters, Lou sneered. Heck, Sheriff, you must be loco to think Jethro would try shooting any man in the back. That's right, Sheriff. Jethro tried to grin, but the snarl refused to leave his twitching face. Lou bumped into me, and my guns went off accidental. Nary bit of harm done, that I can see. Just what is this ruckus, anyhow? The sheriff demanded, eyeing Lee stonily. What was it you said about a holdup? You seen it with your own eyes, real coolly, Jethro rasped. This polecat bandit that calls himself Rip came waltzing in here, stuck a gun on Lou and me, and made Lou fork over that money belt. Rip frowned, glancing quickly at old Juan Amato. Rip was badly puzzled, for he could see no way for Jethro Lee to wiggle out of this tight spot after admitting that he and Lou Trask had had that money belt in their possession. And it was plain that old Juan was puzzled over the same thing, for he was frowning, watching Lee narrowly. There were a dozen or more men yonder at the front door who could swear that Rip had snaked the money belt from inside Trask's shirt and told exactly what was in it without so much as a chance of looking beneath the flaps. Therefore, it certainly looked as if Jethro was letting himself in for some serious trouble by admitting what he had. Or did the ornery Jasper mean to let Lou take the full blame for the whole thing? That angle occurred to Rip just as Lee began laughing hoarsely, as if enjoying some good joke. What's funny? The lank old sheriff asked sourly. Why, it just occurred to me that this here money belt might really belong to this stranger, Lee chuckled thickly. If he can prove that he's really Rip Campbell, I reckon the belt and money is his. What do you mean? The sheriff snapped. Rip saw that Lou was staring uneasily at Lee, as if he half expected the cactus owner to play him some ornery trick. But Jethro Lee had a much slicker trick than that up his sleeve. Grinning broadly now, he leaned back against the bar, hair-matted hands well away from his holstered guns. Why, Lou, here, found that money belt beside the ashes of a campfire over yonder in Coyote Sink, the cactus boss said easily. Lou fetched it here and told me about finding it. We was just ready to come and turn the thing over to you, Sheriff, when this kid come waltzing in and made his play. Rip went pale with rage, yet he was forced to admire Lee's quick thinking. Coyote Sink would likely be that place where I was camped last night when Trask and that Wally Haskell snake jumped me, Rip thought swiftly. Yet he said nothing aloud, for he caught old Juan Amato's eyes and saw that the old fellow was trying desperately to pass him some sort of warning. Juan lifted a bony hand, pressed one finger quickly to his lips. Rip knew then that he was being asked to say no more, and decided to obey. He saw that Jethro and Lou were eyeing him narrowly, waiting tensely for him to speak. But it was the sheriff who spoke. The old officer had reached over to the bar with his free hand and lifted the money belt. Come on, young feller, he said gruffly to Rip. I reckon I'll have to give you free lodging for a while. You mean to slam me in jail? Rip spat the words through locked teeth. I do, the sheriff grunted. And if you're smart, you'll not go raising a fuss. But what in blazes do you want to arrest me for? Rip flared. These two cactus buzzards here wiggled out of a tight corner. I could maybe throw a little more light on. You've went about far enough with me, stranger, Lee cut in, and his voice was flat, dangerously cold. Keep that lip of yours buttoned, and you'll be a sight healthier, Trask warned. The boss, here, might try to help you out of the jug if you behave proper. To blazes with you and that bloated toad beside you, Rip snarled in a sudden flare of temper. You and me have got a few things to settle between us. Come on, the sheriff grunted and leaned forward to grasp at Rip's arm. But the now thoroughly aroused youth spun with the lithe movements of a huge, powerful man, reaching out. He grasped the sheriff's gun wrist, gave one swift, twisting yank, and the officer's weapon went spinning from numbed fingers. Rip's other hand snatched the money belt from the sheriff. Then he was backing away, the money belt dangling from his left hand, a cocked Colt gripped in his lean right fist. "Steady, Sheriff," Rip warned. "And that goes double for your two skunk-scented cactus friends. First man makes a bad move gets leaded some." "I'll hang your hide on the fence if it takes me 10 years, the lean old sheriff thundered. "Dang you, come back here." "Being slung in jail for taking back what was mine doesn't set well, Mr. Sheriff," Rip snapped. "This money is mine, so I'm robbing nobody when I take it. But you'd rather believe that pair of snakes there beside you than listen to reason." "Who said I was believing anybody?" the sheriff countered. "You crazy young galoot, this only gets you into a worse mess." "Maybe so," Rip admitted thinly. "Just the same, Sheriff, I don't aim to be arrested and slammed in your jail yet a while. Adios, and try to have a better excuse next time you set out to jail a man." Rip had been backing down the room as he talked. He managed to stuff the money belt inside his shirt, then drew his second Colt. The doors were at his back now, and he leaned against them, spun suddenly, and was outside, leaping through a scattering crowd. He raced to his big roan, vaulted into the saddle, and spurred behind a building just as a gun crashed from somewhere in the crowd. A slug whistled dismally past his ear, slammed against the adobe he was riding behind. Then he was out of range, letting the big roan level out. He made a thicket of mesquite, and finally worked down into a draw that would shelter him. "Phew," he whistled. "Looks like settling in this neck of the woods is out of the question, horse. I reckon the best thing we can do is—" Rip never finished muttering the words into the breeze which was whipping his lean face. He heard the dull whack of a bullet striking, and felt the big roan beneath him swerve sharply aside. Then the roan was pitching end over end. Dimly Rip heard the distant report of a rifle, and knew in that split second that some pursuer from town had got on the brush rim above him in time to see him riding up the draw. But Rip had only a split second to realize that, for he was hurtling over his falling horse's ears, arms waving helplessly. Then he went crashing into thick brush, to land head first against the bole of a sizable mesquite. He groaned once, then went limp, unaware that 2 men came swarming down toward him from the rim above. And those 2 men were Jethro Lee and Lou Trask. Chapter 5. Rip expected to find himself in jail when he awakened. There was gloom about him, and to his quivering nostrils came a dank odor, as if he were in a room that had seldom been filled with clean air. Rip's head throbbed, and his groping fingers found trickles of sticky moisture along his forehead and cheeks. The crude bandage was gone, and he wondered just how long it had been since his horse had taken that spill. Memory of what had happened brought anger surging up within the puncher, and he sat up slowly. "Some skunk shot my horse from under me," he snarled into the gloom about him. "If I ever find out who done that job, I'll make the Jasper wish he had never learned to sight a gun. Anybody that's low enough to deliberately kill a good—" "Your horse is not dead, muchacho," came Juan Amato's familiar voice. "The bullet hit a mesquite bowl beside your horse, made him jump. The horse, he is not hurt." "Juan," Rip cried excitedly. "What in blazes did they jail you for, amigo?" "I think," the old fellow answered slowly, "that they aim to hang us both, my son." "Hang us?" Rip echoed. "What in blazes would the law have to hang us for?" "The law," came with a grim chuckle from the old Mexican's lean throat. "But surely, muchacho, you do not think we are in the regular jail?" "Huh?" Rip gasped, thoroughly aroused now. "If we ain't in jail, then we're in a mighty good imitation of one." "See, this is what you say, a good imitation of a jail, since jails are supposed to be strong places," Juan Amato chuckled thinly. "Me, I should know about this particular place, for I built it." "You built it?" Rip gasped. "Just what are you driving at, old-timer? I sure don't follow your drift. If we ain't in Sheriff Cooley's jailhouse, then where in blazes are we?" "We are at the Cactus Ranch, son." The old Mexican's voice sounded tired, dull. Once this was my place. It is the great house I built years ago when I was young, like you. This room, it was the place for valuable things to be kept. It is a strong room, one that cannot be broken into easily. Nor can we break out of it easily. The cactus, eh? Rip gritted. Then we've got Lee and his bunch to deal with, eh? How many men has the skunk got here, you reckon? 20 men at least, Juan Amato answered slowly. And our chances with them are what you call few. In fact, I think we will both die sometime this night. Rip was on his feet now, feeling his way about. He heard the rasping of a match and turned to glance down at old Juan Amato, who sat hunched in a corner lighting a stub of candle. Rip glanced quickly about as the yellow light grew to its full strength, tawny eyes raking swiftly along dim walls that were cool to the touch. Those walls were of stone, and Rip knew without being told that the rather long, narrow room in which he found himself was underground. The door yonder leads into the basement, which is under the main house. Juan Amato pointed a skinny hand toward a massive door. Rip nodded, stalked to the door, and shouldered it. He threw most of his weight into the motion, yet the door did not give in the least. From the rim of the gully up which you tried to escape, I saw what happened, the Mexican spoke calmly. I raced down and was trying to give you help when those two evil ones, Jethro and Trask, came up. They took us both prisoners and rushed here with us. No one, I think, saw them do it. In other words, we're plumb out of luck, eh? Rip asked grimly. That's what you're trying to tell me, ain't it? See, that is what I mean, the old fellow nodded. Today, you made a monkey of Lee in public, after killing one of his hired thieves. Besides that, Lee knows that you and I might tell things to Sheriff Cooley. Me, I think Lee will want to make sure you and I do no talking to that sheriff. In that case, the skunk could have killed us both there at the edge of town where my horse took that spill, Rip gritted. If he's fanning to see our hides on the fence, why didn't he drill us then and there? You do not know Jethro, my son, old Juan shrugged. He is the devil, that is sure. We will not die easy deaths, I think. Rip shuddered a little, for there was something dreadfully grim in the old fellow's seamed face and dark eyes. Rip tapped absently at his empty holsters, then just as absently lifted his hands to his middle. He gave a sudden start, for his money belt was missing once more. That snake got my money again, he rasped. Blast his hide, I'd like just one more chance at settling accounts with him. Your money is hidden. Rip spun at the low, hissing words. Juan Amato was on his feet now, stepping forward. There where your horse fell. I dig the hole, and hide the belt with the money when I see that I can never get you away before those evil ones reach us, the old fellow hissed. I dug the hole beneath a cat's claw bush, and hid your belt and money in it. There is the skull of a steer, hiding the fresh earth. If by some miracle you should escape these evil men. The old fellow's voice pinched off. There came the sudden rattling of metal. Then the heavy door at the end of the room opened a few inches. The door was only a pace away, and Rip tensed his lean muscles, ready to leap shoulder first against the door. But old Juan guessed the youth's intention, and gripped his arm with talon-like fingers that were surprisingly strong. There is a stout chain outside the door, which keeps it from opening only those few inches if someone outside wishes it so, Juan whispered. Rip relaxed, groaning inwardly. He had meant to leap against that door, knowing that the sudden move would more than surprise whoever was outside. But with a chain permitting the door to open just so far, lunging against it would avail him nothing. Well, how you two smart Alex feeling now? Lee's evil face showed at the crack of the door. The big Jasper was grinning wolfishly, red-shot black eyes puckered as he looked in upon his two prisoners. It'll be dark in another hour, so you two snakes better start praying, the cactus boss gloated. Know what I aim to do with you two? I know this much, Rip snarled. You ain't got the sand to step in here and fight me man to man. Make it knives, fists, or guns, you snake. If I win, then Juan and me leave here unharmed. If I lose, well, what happens after that is up to you. Lee's face went purple. An oath bubbled past his thick lips, and for a moment it seemed that he would try lunging through that small aperture. From behind him came a shuffling of feet and a mutter of voices, which told Rip that his proposition had been heard by someone beside Jethro. "You lippy young pup," the cactus owner snarled chokingly. "For 2 cents, I'd come in there and give you the worst beating you ever had." "Not you," Rip sneered, hoping desperately to goad the mean-eyed man into some rash play. "You strut around before your men and tell it scary about being a tough hombre. But at heart, you're yellow. You're a cheap, four-flushing, loudmouthed crook who hires his fighting done." "By gosh, boss, that polecat is laying it on thick," a hoarse voice came from outside. "Nope, I'm reading his brand out loud," Rip put in swiftly. "You gents out there that have been drawing fancy pay to do this big snake's dirty work. I reckon you see now why he hires his fighting done. He's too yellow to do it himself." "Yeah," Jethro snarled through quivering lips. "By damn, kid, you're asking for it. Here, hold these cutters of mine. I'm going in there and take the starch out of that loudmouthed slick ear." There were roars of approval from outside. Then the door opened wider. Jethro stalked through the door, a skulking, powerfully built man who knew his rough-and-tumble fighting from A to Z. Rip settled himself for what was to follow, fully aware of the fact that he was in no physical condition to put up much of a scrap. He was a good 20 pounds lighter than Lee, and lacked the arm length of the bigger man. Besides, Rip was weak from the wound in his head, and from the fall he had had that day. "Here's a sample," Jethro snarled and shot a straight, well-timed punch at the youth's head. Rip tried to dodge, but failed. The blow caught him, slammed him back hard against the stone wall. He tripped, fell sidewise. Then Jethro Lee was rushing him, grinning broadly. "Yellow am I?" he roared, and launched a kick at the youth's pale face. The boot toe landed angrily, ripping the skin across Rip's cheek. Rip knew then and there that he was worse than overmatched. Chapter 6. Rip could never remember just how he accomplished it, but he managed somehow to gain his feet. His face was crimson-smeared, plastered with dirt from the floor of the dungeon room that was lighted by a flickering candle. "So you thought you could whip me?" Lee's snarling voice came, as if from a great distance. Rip's blurred eyes swung toward the voice, however, and he could see the bigger man moving toward him swiftly. He dodged instinctively, gasping for breath, sick from the pain of ribs that had cracked when Jethro's boots crashed again and again into his sides. "Stand still, damn you," Lee was snarling again. "All I want is one good punch, so I can stretch you out on the floor again. Next time, polecat, I'm stomping you plumb flat." Rip heard, and fought desperately against the dizziness that was making him weak. He felt the rush of a fist past his crimson and dirt-smeared face, and lashed out blindly at the blurred form before him. His fist landed, yet the bigger man did not so much as grunt. Rip knew the sickening feeling of defeat then, for he realized that without time to rally his strength, he would soon be battered back to the floor and perhaps trampled to death. If I could just keep out of that big Lobo's reach for a minute or two, I might get my wind back, Rip thought swiftly. But even as the thought drilled through his numbed brain, a fist crashed into the base of his neck, flinging him back savagely. But for the damp stone wall of the dungeon, Rip would have gone down then and there. As it was, he flung his arms wide, wobbly legs braced as he leaned against the wall. Through glazed eyes he saw Jethro rushing in, grinning wolfishly. Rip mustered every ounce of his remaining strength, shoved himself forward from the wall, and flung a looping right at the swimming face before him. He felt the numb jolt of his fist landing, and saw crimson splatter from Lee's nose. The cactus boss rocked back, howling oaths. "Damn it, unhook that chain," a voice that was edged by excitement demanded. "Trask, you and them other two is getting all the sights while the rest of us stand back. Open the door a mite, and we can all see." The words struck through Rip's pain-fogged brain, causing him to go suddenly tense. If the chain on that door was unhooked, he might conceivably make a break, get out into the hallway, and get his hands on a gun. He thought was like a plunge into cool water. Rip's tawny eyes cleared rapidly, and his brain became clear-cool. He twisted his crimson-smeared face into a grin as he saw Jethro skulking toward him, cautious after that wallop on the nose. Lee's teeth showed in a snarl, and there was murder in his eyes as he advanced. But Rip felt like whooping, for he saw the heavy door swing wider. The chain had been unhooked. Rip's grin and the sudden puckering cold gaze of his tawny eyes warned Jethro. The big Jasper halted, staring uneasily, crimson dripping from his nose. "Shoot, Lee, don't start running just when I'm getting warmed up," Rip taunted. "But I reckon I can keep you hemmed up in here, at that." From the tail of his eye, Rip measured the distance to the door that was now half open and jammed with the evil faces of Lee's gang. "Running, am I?" Lee's voice warned Rip. The youth jerked his eyes back to Lee, and was barely in time to dodge a blow that would have stretched him out cold. Rip struck up and out sharply, knowing that he was too far away to land anything resembling a telling blow. But the whiz of his fist before Lee's face caused the big Jasper to dodge back, which gave Rip time to get his balance. Then Rip backed before a sudden charge, only too glad of the chance. For backing carried him toward the door. He pretended to stumble, and took a blow on the point of his shoulder that staggered him. But the door was almost at his back now, and he barely felt the pain of that blow, so intent was he on putting his plan into effect. "I got you," Jethro roared. "I'll twist you in two, kid. Just wait until I get my hands on you. I'll break." Rip pretended to stumble again, then dropped suddenly flat to the floor. Jethro tripped over the youth's lean body, went crashing forward, mighty body striking the partly open door with terrific force. There were howls of pain and surprise as the door swept men back and down. Rip leapt up, breath sobbing with the effort of forcing his numbed and aching muscles to act. He gained his feet, dived into the tangle of men there in the black hallway that led from the dungeon room into the basement proper. There were oaths and yells, and the churning of bodies against the hard dirt floor. But Rip was paying no attention to the yells and oaths and the blows that were rained upon him. His hands were groping, clawing at the men he sprawled across. Then his fingers found a gun butt, clamped down. He wrenched the gun free, threw his body sidewise. He saw Jethro now, saw the huge Jasper leap up from that tangle of bodies. Lee cursed wildly, kicked out savagely at the men about him. Rip gained his feet, batted a man loose from him with the Colt he had taken, and limped toward the hulking boss of the snarling pack. Rip thumbed back the hammer of the gun, jammed the muzzle hard into Lee's middle. "Steady, you skunk," he snarled. "And get this through your head. If you or any of your gang make a bad move, you're the first gent I'll plug." Jethro went stiff, huge hands hooked, ready to claw down at the gun. Rip slithered sidewise, got behind Lee, and bored in hard with the muzzle of the gun he held. "Better quiet your pack, feller," he snarled. "Remember, you get shot first if things go wrong." Others heard Rip's voice now, and there was a sudden hush over the dank corridor. "My gosh," a hoarse voice wheezed. "That kid is out of the dungeon. And he's got the drop on the boss." "Order your gang into the dungeon," Rip ordered grimly. "Tell 'em to go in backward, single file." "On," he yelled loudly in the next breath. "Si, muchacho," came the reply. "I am here, within the door." "Bueno," Rip clipped. "When Lee's little of skunks back past you, they'll come one at a time and move slow. Take their guns, Juan, as they go into the dungeon." Go ahead, men," Jethro gulped. "This snake has got me cold turkey, boys. You better do like he says, I reckon." There were 9 men there, besides Lee. They stood crouched, snarling like cornered beasts, hands trembling above holstered guns. Some of them looked battered from being struck by the door and their boss's fists. But they were ready for battle, and Rip held his breath as he waited to see what effect Lee's orders would have. To Rip's vast relief, 4 or 5 of the tough customers stepped forward, their hands lifting. One turned his back, started backing clumsily through the door. Rip saw Old Juan's skinny hands flash out, lift twin guns from the cactus tuft's holsters. Then another man approached the door, turned his back to it, and began backing slowly. Rip relaxed a little, breathing for the first time in several seconds. Once those toughs were inside that vault-like room, the rest would be simple. The third man was approaching the door now, backing through. In another minute or two, they would all be inside. "Say, what are we, anyway?" Trask's voice lashed suddenly through the gloom. "The odds is 10-2 in our favor. Do you Jaspers aim to let one cow-puncher and that stove-up old man run you into that blasted dungeon and leave you there to rot?" "Shut up," Jethro croaked. "This gun is boring my back. If you make this feller sore, he might drill me." "Rip ain't the sort to shoot a defenseless man," Trask cackled shrilly. "Just stand with your hands up, boss, and you're safe. Me, I'll slide up the stairs and see that Rip and his old friend don't get out of the basement. You can." Rip waited to hear no more. Realizing that the rest would turn on him now that Trask had made the break, he knew that his only hope lay in beating the others to the action. He sprang across the gloomy corridor, the gun he had captured weaving before him. He saw an evil yet beautiful flower of blazing powder bloom briefly in the gloom ahead, and fired above and to one side of it. There was a shrill yell behind him that penetrated to his consciousness even in that tense moment. There was something strangely wild, almost barbaric in that shrill, drawn-out cry that echoed down the corridor. Then guns were booming, and men were screaming in fear and anger as they scuttled this way and that, like rats in a sinking ship. Rip could have dashed on down the gloomy corridor, for he had headed the seething mass of excited men now. But his mind was suddenly on Old Juan. Rip had hoped to reach Trask, manage somehow to hold the cactus pack at bay. But he saw now that the task was hopeless, for the gang was bearing down upon him like stampeding cattle. He fired 2 shots over their heads, but they came on, yelling, crowding, not even returning his fire. Groaning, Rip reeled in close to the wall, gun poised to lash out at the first man who came in reach. But he found that there was a sort of recess in the wall at his back, and staggered into it while the men streamed past. "Beat them to the stairs, boys," Jethro's heavy voice boomed as the shadowy figures seethed past. "We've still got the snakes bottled if we get to the basement stairs first. And don't shoot to kill, for I aim to make them two tell us where they hid that $4,000 before we leave their carcasses swinging where folks can see them." The gang was past now, and Rip turned grimly back down the corridor. Candlelight was gone from the dungeon room, and he was forced to feel his way along the damp wall. He stumbled over a body in the doorway of the dungeon, dropped swiftly to his knees, free hand groping. His fingers encountered rough leather garments, and he knew that the man who lay there was Old Juan. "Too late," Rip gritted. "I turned back to help the old gent when it was already too late. And now I'm trapped for fair." Chapter 7. Rip dragged the limp form of the aged man through the door. He found and closed the heavy portal by feel alone, then fished a match from his pocket. He struck the match, peering down into the Mexican's leathery face. There was an ugly red tint to the old fellow's grizzled hair along one side of the head. But Rip had to search for and light the stub of candle before he could make much of an examination. He bent above the old rancher after the candle was burning, examined the crimsoned patch of grizzled hair. Rip saw then that he was not too late, for Old Juan suffered nothing more than a deeply cut scalp. Even as Rip discovered that, the old fellow moaned, rolled half over. Rip glanced quickly, helplessly about the long damp room. His tawny eyes glowed when he saw the 4.6 guns lying there on the floor, where Old Juan had evidently tossed them as he disarmed the cactus men. Rip selected a well-matched pair of weapons, shoved them into his holsters after making sure they used the same caliber cartridges as he carried in his belt loops. He raked the other guns closer to the candle, thinking grimly that with so many weapons at hand he could at least make it hot for the cactus cutthroats if they came after him again. What? Old Juan's voice jerked Rip's glittering eyes down. The fellow was sitting up, feeling gently of his cut scalp as he stared questioningly at Rip. You did not make the break, then? The old man asked slowly. For why did you not run for the stairs? And leave you behind? Rip growled. Not much doing. We're in a bad spot, that's true. But we've got us some guns, anyhow. Feel like walking up to the basement you mentioned? The door then is not locked? The old fellow asked. Nope, Rip gritted. I pulled it shut, so as none of them snakes could sneak back and take a pot shot at me while I looked at your hurts. I'll put out the candle, then we can open the door safe enough. If you had not come back, my son, I would have been killed by those bandits most likely. Juan's voice came through the darkness now, for Rip had snuffed out the candle. I reckon we'll both likely get our tickets, Rip answered grimly as he felt for the door and shoved it open. But I aim to make it interesting for them snakes. They'll starve us out in the long run, sure. But no, old Juan chuckled softly. Remember, my son, I built this house in those days when the Apaches were to be feared. Gosh, that reminds me, Rip croaked. I heard a war cry that sounded like the yell of an Apache a while ago. Some of them cactus snakes must have been on the prod for fair. I did the yelling, Juan chuckled at Rip's elbow. I heard it many times when I was the young man, and fought with those Apaches. I knew fear of it then, and knew that those bandits would also fear it in darkness. So that's what stampeded the snakes, Rip gritted. But right now, we'd better get up into that basement. If we had water and food, we might make a decent stand at that. But as it is, our chances are slim. But we are no longer prisoners, Juan chuckled again. Come, my son. I lead the way. Those lean, strong old fingers bit into Rip's arm, guiding him along the darkened passageway. Then Juan was halting before the nook in the wall, where Rip had crouched to let the fear-maddened cactus killers pass him. Say, you don't mean there's some secret way out of this place, do you? Rip asked tensely, for he heard a sudden groaning sound, and felt damp chill air fan his face. Just so, old Juan laughed. In 5 minutes we will be at the hidden cave, well beyond the house. Hold to my jacket. Rip grasped the scarred leather jacket with trembling fingers, gripped it tight. Down through a tunnel that was damp and narrow, old Juan led the way for what seemed ages. Yet it was scarcely 5 minutes, until a patch of dim light showed ahead of them. Rip wanted to shout with joy when he sniffed clean, sweet air that grew tangy and hot with desert dryness as they approached the light. Then they were in a small cave, where thick brush formed a heavy screen before them. This way, Juan panted, and turned along the dim line of an old trail. A moment later, Juan and Rip were lying flat on their stomachs atop a round knoll, looking out and down upon a great, rambling adobe house. Beyond the house were barns, corrals, and many smaller buildings. My home, old Juan said simply. Many years, that was the home of Anna and me. But now, how'd that Lee snake get it away from you? Rip asked tensely. Juan, you must have been a rich man when you owned such a place as this. See, I was what you call rich, the old Mexican nodded. But my cattle, they suddenly start to vanish. Finally, I have to borrow the money to buy more cattle. I borrowed it from the man I thought a good neighbor, Jethro Lee. And you lost the place because you could not pay back what you borrowed. Rip mused, studying the great comfortable ranch house through puckered lids. When I sell the cows and go to pay back the 2,000 which I borrow, the paper says 20,000, not 2,000, the old man gritted suddenly. This man, he had what you call raised the amount of the note. I had not the 20,000. So Lee takes away the ranch, which is mine. Look, Rip cried suddenly. By golly, yonder comes the sheriff and a posse. Do you reckon they've found out that you and me was brought here? The two watchers grew tense with excitement. A dozen mounted men had swarmed up out of a draw, and were spurring toward the great arch that was the front gate. Men poured from the house, and Lee's huge form bulked above his hirelings as he led the way down the long walk to the gate. There was a lot of talking down there for the next few minutes. Then cactus men were running to the corrals, roping out horses. A few minutes later, the sheriff and his posse were galloping away with 5 cactus men. Rip was just as excited as if the sheriff and his posse had been a rescue party, however. He watched until the posse vanished, and Jethro and his 3 men had again rushed back into the house. "Come on," Rip snapped. "You know the place, so lead the way. There's only 4 of them snakes left down there now. I'm calling a showdown." Juan would have protested, but Rip gave him no chance. Instead of waiting for Juan, the lanky youth leaped to his feet, sprinted down the hill, and gained the back of an outbuilding. A few minutes later, Rip was pressing close to the back wall of the main house, panting from the hard, swift run. Juan came up, glaring his protest and looking pleased at the same time. The old man had brought a pair of businesslike 6 guns from the dungeon room, and was now drawing them to inspect them carefully. "How can we get into the house with the least trouble?" Rip whispered. Juan nodded his understanding, slid along the wall. The sun was just setting, and Rip wished suddenly that he had waited until dusk to make his attack. But it was too late now, and he followed Juan around a corner of the building to what was obviously a patio. They went through a tall gate, guns out, eyes alert. Then they were across the patio, walking along worn tiles beneath a long porch. Juan turned suddenly to a tall door, tried the latch, and stepped into a hallway. Voices came to them instantly, and they heard a man laughing. Juan nodded his grizzled head, moved cat-like down the hallway toward a wide arch. "We'll not bother with them 2 snakes down in the cellar until some time tomorrow," Jethro was saying. "No chance of them breaking out, but we'll keep a guard at the cellar door all night." "That blasted sheriff sure threw a scare into me, showing up like he done," Trask's voice snarled. "But you worked it slick when you offered to send the boys along with his posse. When they find that Rip snake, he'll be swinging from a limb someplace close to town. We've got to hang that Campbell and the old man for folks to look at, after what happened in the saloon in town today," Jethro snarled. "But we'll do that chore as soon as we starve them 2 into telling where that 4,000 is hid. Buzz, you and Pink jar loose from that jug and pass it over this way." Rip and Juan came to the great archway, stood looking down into a huge, low-ceilinged living room. At a long table in the center of the room sat Jethro, Trask, and 2 others. Trask took a gallon jug in his hands, tilted it to his lips, and let raw whiskey spill out over his shirt front. He was staring at the big archway, trying to speak through lips that were numb and sagging. "Look out," he squalled at last, and let the jug roll from his trembling hands. The jug hit the tiled floor, smashed to hundreds of pieces. Jethro and the other 2 at the table leapt up, whirling. "Steady, you sidewinders," Rip rasped. "If you make a fool play." A shrill, piercing yell lashed the room, seemed to rebound from every wall in multiplied echoes. Juan had yelled his Apache war cry, and the cactus toughs jumped in their boots. But their hands had already been slapping down as he yelled, and now the sudden, blasting roar of 6 guns drowned out the echoes of that eerie war cry. Rip felt a slug fan his face as he went forward behind spitting guns. He saw Trask fold over the back of a deep-seated chair, heard the pale-eyed killer's choking wail of death. Then a slug caught Rip in the ribs, jerking him half around. But from the tail of his eye, he saw another cactus man hit the floor in a limp heap. "Kill them too," Jethro screamed. "Drill them too before they—" Rip's guns matched the thunder of the cactus owners. Lee's voice trailed off, became a choking gasp. He crashed into the table, dropped sidewise to the floor. The remaining cactus man was dropping his guns, lifting his hands through the dim blue death pall that was powder smoke in the room. The man who had surrendered was heavy of jowl, fat, paunchy looking. He stood shaking visibly, greenish eyes protruding in terror as Rip reeled forward, grinning harshly behind smoking guns. Beside Rip came old Juan, hot gun weaving. I wanted to wing Lee, make him talk, Rip growled. But it looks like. Don't plug me no more, Jethro's thick voice came chokingly. I'm sure done for men. Don't shoot a man that's already dying. Talk, Rip rasped, kneeling beside the white-faced cactus boss. Tell us how you got possession of this ranch. Loaned old Amato $2,000, Lee choked. I raised the note to $20,000. Knew he couldn't pay. I stole him blind first. So, he'd have to borrow money. Then I loaned him that $2,000 and the voice choked off, died. Jethro Lee's hard eyes went blank, glazed over. Hombre, Rip snarled up at the fat Jasper who had surrendered. Did you hear what your boss said as he cashed in his chips? Can you remember that? And remember to repeat it to the sheriff. In case you do, you'll get a chance to hunt a healthier climate. Sure, the man gulped. My name is Pink Belton. I can remember what the boss said, the fat hombre gasped. I'll be only too glad to tell what I know if you'll give me a chance to ride that way. And I'll tell the sheriff how you was first jumped by Haskell and Trask too, when they was out watching Coyote sink for a Cattlemen's Association detective that was supposed to be prowling up this way. Fair enough, Rip nodded, then turned to grin at Juan. That money of mine made pretty good skunk bait at that. Rip smiled wanly. Tie that Jasper up, then see if you can't wrap something around my side. A bullet gouged me, and it needs looking after. When this man named Pink tells to the sheriff what he knows, then I get my ranch back, Juan said a few minutes later, as he finished bandaging a gash along Rip's side. Suppose, my son, you take the money which you say was the skunk bait and buy the cows. I have the ranch, you have the money. That way we are what you call the partners, no? You mean it? Rip gasped. Why, this is a fine big spread. My measly 4,000 would buy many cows. The old fellow smiled happily. Then it is settled. My wife and me, we are old and lonesome, my son. If you would be with us here and help us run the ranch which would someday be yours, we would be lonesome no more. It is, how you say it, the deal, eh? You will shake the hands, no? Rip could not speak over the lump that was in his throat. But he reached up and felt his hand gripped by those bony, strong fingers. Juan smiled happily. So, my son, we are now the partners, he said simply, and turned wait the return of the posse and the truth. The end. Do you like wild Western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 wild Western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today.